Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be discussing how to close the gap in reading and literacy instruction by effectively utilizing flexible grouping. The goals and objectives for today are to analyze the 2014-2015 District Report Card data and discuss next steps for instruction. We will examine how to close the gap using flexible grouping in reading and literacy instruction. By the end of this presentation, you will be able to explain what flexible grouping is from a research-based perspective. You will be able to discuss how to effectively create flexible groups for grades K through 12 and understand how to incorporate flexible groups into your teaching. When examining the 2014-2015 District Report Card data, there are several components. The first is achievement. Performance reflects the percent of students who pass state tests. In our district, 66% passed, giving us a D rating. Indicators met asks how well students did on state tests. In our district, we scored a 33.3% or an F rating. Progress or value added examines math and reading progress for grades 4 through 8 in the district and answers the question, did students make a year's worth of growth? Looking at the data, we can see that overall we scored an A. Our gifted students scored a C. The lowest 20% in achievement scored an A, and students with disabilities scored an A. We have data here to be proud of, but these ratings also help us to see that we need to focus more attention on helping our gifted students make appropriate gains. Overall, our 4th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders received an A rating in English Language Arts. Our 5th graders, district-wide, received a C on the English Language Arts test. Gap closing rating answers the question, is every student succeeding regardless of income, race, ethnicity, or disability? For this area, we received an F, or a 22.7%. This is where we must focus our attention on utilizing flexible groups. This chart to the right shows our data chart for closing the reading gap. Annual Measurable Objectives, or AMOs, compare performance of groups to a state goal, which is the red line. In our district, white students are the only group meeting the state goal. Every other group shows gaps. We need to work to lessen these gaps in order to meet the various learning needs of our diverse population of students. The graduation rate asks how many 9th graders graduated in 4 to 5 years. 90%, or a B rating, graduated in 4 years. 91.7%, also a B rating, graduated in 5 years. Considering our high poverty population, this is something we certainly should be proud of, especially since this was higher than the state average and similar districts. The K-3 literacy component answers the question, are more students learning to read in K through 3rd grade? When looking at this data, we can see that 121 kindergartners were not on track, but 62% of them improved to on track in 1st grade. 16 first graders were not on track, but 31.3% improved to on track in 2nd grade. 42 second graders were not on track, but 23.8% improved to on track in 3rd grade. 122 third graders were not on track, but 28.7% reached proficiency on the OAA. 94.3% of 3rd graders met the 3rd grade reading guarantee for promotion to 4th grade, but only 69.4% of 3rd graders scored proficient on the state reading test, meaning 24.9% of 3rd graders scored below proficient on the state reading test but were still promoted to 4th grade. In an article entitled Making Instructional Decisions Based on Data, What, How, and Why, Makatari, Rosemary, and Edwards described the data analysis framework for instructional decision-making. There are 3 data categories for improving reading and writing instruction, including professional development data, classroom data, and reading performance data. We have just analyzed our reading performance data using our 2014-2015 state report card. As a team, we should use the worksheet for instructional decision making to determine how instructional time is being spent and to analyze the data to see how we can incorporate more opportunities for flexible groups. Take a minute now to read this worksheet and reflect on your own practices. What are the implications for change as you see them in your role? Consider this. The Ohio Teacher Evaluation System, or OTES, uses student growth measures and teacher performance to rate teachers as ineffective, developing, skilled, and accomplished. How would you feel if I grouped you all today based on your OTES rating? Would this label make you feel insecure in any ways? If given an assignment or task to complete, how might this label affect your group's productivity? How might the dynamics of the groups change if I grouped you based on the teaching standard in which you received the highest rating? Do you allow your OTES rating to define you as a teacher, or do you consider yourself to be more skilled in some areas than others? How do you think this relates to what we should consider when grouping our students? Authors of Reading and Learning to Read describe the rationale for flexible grouping by explaining that the practice of creating groups of various sizes, abilities, and interests has been implemented since the 1920s. Throughout the years, however, students' abilities have been tracked, limiting opportunities especially for students from minority and low socioeconomic backgrounds as they were placed in remedial programs. The rationale here is to create greater opportunities for all students and types of learners. The authors of Reading and Learning to Read define grouping as a means of organizing teaching. The authors describe a broader term for grouping as patterns for learning, which include grouping practices used in classrooms that are dynamic and flexible. Flexible grouping is not anti-ability grouping, but we do want to avoid creating general, low, middle, and high reading groups that never change throughout the year. If choosing to create homogeneous groups, teachers should focus on specific skills or abilities. For example, you may group students based on their comprehension skills or their ability to find the main idea in a multi-paragraph text. Doing this will allow for stronger differentiation. According to the authors of Reading and Learning to Read, flexible groups may include whole groups, small groups, pairs, triads, cooperative groups, heterogeneous groups, homogeneous groups, and groups that are self-paced, individualized, or interest-based. Flexibility also refers to creating flexible activities, varying time spent in groups, and creating groups that may be well-planned or spontaneous. Sometimes the teacher may select groups, or other times students may select their group members. But groups change not only throughout the year, but also throughout the day, the school week, or following an assignment depending on the learning outcome. When deciding if homogeneous or same ability groups or heterogeneous mixed ability groups would be best, remember to consider the learning outcome. Take a minute to review this chart. In which settings would homogeneous groups work best? When would it be best to use heterogeneous groups? When creating flexible groups, consider the purpose for instruction. Provide different experiences for students with different learning outcomes. This will depend on the teacher's beliefs, the learning goals and students' needs. Groups may be based on interest, achievement levels, or activity preferences. Teachers may also consider special needs, learning styles, rates, and abilities. Group work should be meaningful and connected to instruction. Allow for connections across learners. Provide flexibility in how students read and respond to texts. When implementing flexible groups, directly teach routines and expectations for movement, voice level, responsibilities, and how to collaborate. These routines should be practiced, especially at the elementary level. Explain to your students how and why these groups have been formed, the length of time students will be in groups, and the nature of the activity. Teachers can vary assignments for different groups. Assess throughout the unit to make any necessary changes. Teachers should interact with groups to keep students focused and observe their learning. A model teachers may consider is pre-testing students first, then introducing the concept and reinforcing the learning with activities and discussions. Test your students midway through the learning and then form and implement flexible groups before the final evaluation. Instructional tips for flexible grouping. Have a system or chart so groups are clearly identified. Give specific instructions and consider posting these in written form. Model and practice transitional routines often, especially at the elementary level. Display a countdown clock or set an alarm while students are working. Hold students accountable for work completed in groups by having them rate their effectiveness or write about what their group accomplished. The authors of Maximizing Student Learning with Flexible Groups created a chart to define expected behaviors for group work. You may consider posting something like this in your classroom. Group work looks like facing partners, completing work, cooperating, sharing materials, making eye contact with the speaker, and exhibiting on-task behaviors. Group work sounds like elaborating on comments, acknowledging others, asking clarifying questions, using indoor voices, and saying things like, "I like how you solved that problem," or "Let's try it this way." In our district, we are working to close the gap. In order to do this, we need to closely examine how we are differentiating instruction, especially for our highest and lowest performers. In an article entitled Differentiated Instruction, Making Informed Teacher Decisions, the authors explained, in an RTI framework, providing differentiated and responsive instruction is an important prerequisite to referring a child for special education services. This is significant because we need to be sure we are making informed instructional decisions that will help close learning gaps. The most effective differentiation is found in decisions teachers make. Teachers should learn about their students and how they learn best. During group work, observe and document often. Rearrange small groups frequently to match changing strengths and needs. Based on our state report card, we are struggling to provide appropriate enrichments to increase student learning for our gifted students. Flexible groups extend the learning of gifted students by allowing for additional exploration for high-ability students. Gifted students thrive in these settings. Learning in flexible groups can be open-ended and creative. It allows for leaders and role models to emerge, providing other students with peer mentors. Different projects to showcase strengths and needs and also to build on weaknesses can be incorporated using flexible groups. Flexible groups increase mastery, motivation, and engagement. Elementary teachers and elementary specialists, you have a red name tag on right now. Middle school teachers and specialists, your name tag is yellow. Secondary teachers and specialists, you currently have a blue name tag on. When I say go, find someone with a different colored name tag than your own. Briefly introduce yourself. You have 3 minutes to discuss how you effectively group students for literacy instruction. Be prepared to share your partner's response. Begin. Flexible grouping in the elementary setting. The first step when you're creating flexible groups is to analyze meaningful data frequently. Use pre, mid, and post-assessment data effectively. Compact instruction for high achievers when appropriate. Determine what the data shows and consider the learning outcome. Create groups that are based on informed decision-making. When making your groups, consider the personalities and student interests. Consider grouping across classrooms if you are self-contained. In our district, our elementary classrooms are self-contained. We most often use STAR data to make any of our instructional decisions. Within STAR, we can examine student achievement by standard. As a grade-level team, you may consider looking for learning patterns across classrooms in order to create grade-level flexible groups. This will allow you to better differentiate instruction if each grade-level teacher focuses on one specific standard with students at a similar level of understanding. Differentiate instruction through the use of centers, but also provide differentiation within your centers. Incorporate small group and guided instruction often. At the elementary level, our students are reading at very different levels. Modeling and guided instruction is very important at this stage. Be sure to address individual student learning needs within small groups and rearrange students when necessary. Steps 1 through 5 are the same for middle school groups. In middle school, teachers may begin to allow students to take more responsibility for their learning. By grouping based on interest, students will be able to explore topics with their peers that will engage them in the learning and motivate them to read. This is very important at this stage. This is why we should use student interest of reading materials to group for literature circles. Middle school teachers should also differentiate instruction through the use of learning stations and incorporate cross-curricular project-based learning opportunities. Incorporate small group and guided instruction often. In middle school, teachers should still meet individual needs and work to close the reading gaps through the use of guided instruction. Also address individual student learning needs within small groups and rearrange students when necessary. In the high school or secondary setting, steps 1 through 6 are the same as they were for the middle school groups. However, teachers at this level will reach more students if they incorporate project-based learning experiences that allow students to facilitate their learning. Differentiate instruction through the use of project-based learning opportunities. Also, frequently incorporate cross-curricular project-based learning opportunities. One way to be sure students are contributing in small group instruction is by assigning each student a specific role in the group. Teachers should assign students specific roles, or perhaps students may be able to choose their roles in the small group setting to make sure that they are engaged in the learning. Address individual student learning needs within small groups and rearrange students when necessary. Although teachers may not be providing guided instruction, they must still be involved in the learning. Let's brainstorm. How could special education intervention specialists, reading specialists, and gifted intervention specialists collaborate to support one another and the students they serve? What are the parallels between each of these roles? How could these specialists work together to close the gap? Let's consider some options such as pushing in versus pulling out, and incorporating their services into flexible grouping models. to serve students other than those on their caseload. Woodward and Talbert Johnson in Reading Intervention Models, Challenges of Classroom Support and Separated Instruction surveyed classroom teachers and reading specialists and found 60% of classroom teachers surveyed agreed or strongly agreed that when pulled out, students miss instruction time or time to work on assignments. Also, only 24% of reading specialists surveyed felt 30 minutes per day was adequate time for students to work with the reading specialist. What teachers are saying about separated instruction is that it limits communication with the reading specialists. Also, scheduling and accessibility becomes an issue when reading specialists are only working with students who struggle. In our district, we're working to close the gap. It's important that reading specialists also have opportunities to enrich learning for gifted students. Teachers are saying that students are missing instruction and classwork when separated instruction is incorporated. Separated instruction limits reading with the classroom teacher, and instructional inconsistencies happen when the reading specialist and the classroom teacher are teaching different things in their small groups. With separated instruction, there's less opportunity for mixed ability groups. Reading specialists are saying that it limits professional interactions. When reading specialists have the opportunity to push into the classroom, they're able to model examples for teachers, but are unable to do this when they are pulling students from the room. A pull-out model is also inflexible, and there are no positive peer role models when all students in the group are at one level. There's less time for the reading specialist to work with other students. It can involve problems with transitioning when students have to move from the classroom to the reading specialist room, and creates other potential problems such as behavior problems or losing classroom materials. Student confidence can be affected in separated instruction when students feel targeted because they're always being pulled out because of their reading difficulties. Also, reading specialists recognize that it's difficult for teachers to schedule whole group instruction in a separated instruction model. When analyzing the data, we need to look most closely at what it means to close the gap. Closing the gap means focusing on various populations, including special education, Title I, and gifted education. We need to highlight the strengths of all learners. We should recognize the full potential of each individual student and include all populations in flexible groups. We need to avoid stereotyping students with labels. Instead of seeing students as special education or gifted students, recognize the strength and areas for improvement for each individual child. How do you avoid labeling your students? How do you see them as individuals? What do you do to get to know your students personally? How do you build relationships with your students? When analyzing the data and forming flexible groups, we need to make sure we are looking at the whole child. Avoid grouping based solely on ability. Students should be working with different individuals throughout the day. Avoid seeing groups as permanent placements. When forming groups, consider the activity and the learning outcomes. Students should move frequently among groups. And remember, consider grouping within your grade level or even across grade levels to best differentiate instruction. Using the note card you have in front of you, reflect on and record the following. Write down 3 things you learned about flexible grouping that you plan to incorporate into your teaching. Write down 2 things you found interesting about flexible grouping. Write down 1 question you still have about something you learned today, and make sure to turn it in before you leave. If you are interested in learning more, here are some professional development videos for additional learning. The first is on purposeful grouping for collaboration. The second is on choosing collaborative groups. and the final video is on using expertise to group students. These links will be shared with you. Thank you so much for your time today.